Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Garrison Institute's Pathways to Planetary Health Forum. I am Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. Before we begin today's session, let's review a few logistical items about our gathering. We are on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video, that means you guys out there, will remain off for the duration of the webinar. Please direct any questions to the Q&A box below, and we'll try and integrate them into today's conversation. We are recording these sessions, and you'll have a chance to view the recordings of this, plus the other amazing talks we've had, and upcoming programs at garrisoninstitute.org. This is an interactive online event, which is part of the Pathways to Planetary Health Forum 2024 series, which explores topics like regeneration and earth wisdoms across 4 pathways: the common good, ecological cultures, regenerative economies, and biodiversity stewardship. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guests today, Kate Raworth, Leonora Grcheva, and Erinch Sahan of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Kate is a renegade economist focusing on economics fit for 21st century realities. She began working with Oxfam and on the Human Development Report for UNDP, in which she realized that the current systems of economics was completely misfit for the actual issues that we are dealing with today. And in her brilliant synthesis of all this, she created an image that Doughnut and an idea about Doughnut economics, which gives us new ways to think about economies and human culture and what it really takes for us to both support the development of and human social needs at the same time as respecting planetary boundaries. Her book, a best-selling international book called Doughnut Economics, which we encourage you all to buy, has been translated into over 20 languages, so you have no excuses to not buy it, and has widely influenced audiences ranging from the UN General Assembly to Pope Francis and the King of Bhutan. Leonora joined the Doughnut Economics Action Lab to lead their engagements with cities, municipalities, and other place-based administrations that are putting Doughnut economics into practice in their own context. So the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, or DEAL, was created to actually take these amazing ideas and actually transform reality on the ground. Leonora is an urban planner, a researcher, a participant, practitioner. She has over a decade of experience facilitating engagement with communities, cities, regions, globally through her work as an urban planning consulting for UN Habitat, a city leadership associate for the University College of London, and a community engagement consultant for a variety of built projects in the UK. Erinch Sahan is a business and enterprise lead at DEAL, and he was recently the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization and previously spent 7 years at Oxfam leading campaigns initiatives. And he founded Oxfam Future of Business Initiative. And we should probably put a link into Oxfam because so many of the roots of this come out of Oxfam, and it is doing such amazing work. So by the way, we will, in the chat, as great ideas come up, our amazing team at the Garrison Institute will put in links into the chat so you, the participants, can find ways to expand your thinking. You don't have to do it now while you're devotedly listening to us. You can do that later. Erinch is a board member of the Social Enterprise World Forum. He teaches sustainability value chains at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and he holds degrees in finance and law. Okay. Hey, so first of all, I understand you're writing a new economics textbook. Why? What's wrong with the old ones?
What's wrong with the old ones? Well, I figured that out when I was at university 30 years ago, studying economics, wanting to learn the mother tongue of public policy. The old ones are really old. They're really based on a totally outdated Western-centric worldview that doesn't serve the crises and the times that we face. And we desperately need foundational ideas that serve our times. I mean, let me just put it very simply, the foundational idea of what is the shape of progress. If you open almost any economics textbook, the diagram's never drawn because it's so deep It underlies, but here we are, use bit yellow hose. The shape of progress is endless growth, right? It's this curve, exponential growth. And that underlies every economics conversation. And we profoundly need to challenge that and remove that imprint from our minds and have a different worldview. So it's not just about writing new equations and writing new, tweaking the policies. It's going really deep to the foundations of what on earth an economy is and what it means and what is the shape of progress for economic success. So yes, we need new economics textbooks preceded by deeper new economic thinking.
Right. So really what we need is a new social understanding and a social contract about it. And then economics are just one part of how we manifest that. And what's interesting is we live in a culture now that over the last 100 years has substituted economics for almost everything else that matters. I mean, it hasn't I'll rephrase that. The things that matter still matter, but the language of economics has colonized the way we think, or is trying to colonize the way we think about so much else. So part of this is also about putting economics in its proper place.
I think that's right. I think that's right. The language of economic thinking, market-based thinking, market-centric thinking. People are customers or consumers. We're not. We're people. But the dominance of economic thinking has crowded out social space, political space. And as you say, we need to pull back and widen our gaze and realize that economic activity is a subset of a much greater whole, and including a much greater ecological whole. So zooming out and getting a much bigger worldview rather than diving in and letting it be framed entirely by economics, which I agree has been really predominant in neoliberal era since 70s, 80s. Milton Friedman won for a while. And
for a while, we're going to beat him.
Overwhelming that, yeah.
You know, what's interesting is that at the very root of economics, like if you go to what is the atom of economics? It's a transaction. I sold something you bought. It may come out of complexity, but its core bottom line is this transaction. If you look at ecology and the way nature works, everything is enormously multi-way. So you look at a tree's relationship with the air and the minerals in the ground and the micro, fibers that connect it to other trees and the chemicals that it used to communicate, etc. And it's got this incredible simultaneous, amazing emergent interdependence. Everything does. And all that is lost if you simplify it to just a buy-sell simple transaction.
Yeah, and that's one kind of economics that's been incredibly dominant. I mean, I often give lectures to students in lecture theatres around the world, or indeed to adults. And so, there's always around 20, 30, 40, 50% of people in the room who've studied some kind of economics. Many, many people have had this inducted into their mindset at some point. And I often ask, what's the first diagram you remember being taught? Same answer worldwide: supply and demand. It comes out. So it's that transaction that you just mentioned. But I mean, I could playfully push back and say, well, even a transaction, it's a relation, right? It requires at least two people. There's a buyer and a seller. There is a relation, but it's conducted through price-based negotiation and exchange. So I think there's something even more fundamental under that, and that's the individual. If you look at economic theory, macro or micro, at the heart of the models is a unit, the atom, right? So economics in some ways mimicking the brilliance of Isaac Newton, who said, if we just boil everything down to an atom, we can understand not only how an apple falls and how moons orbit, we can understand so much of the world. And economics mimic that. And here is the atomic version of economics. This is a depiction of rational economic man. This is the atom at the heart of economic models. So it would be a man with no dependents, no relations visible in this picture, right? Nobody getting in the way you have to look after or be cared by. With ego in his heart, self-interest, money in his hand, there's your market transaction, calculator in his head, ever calculating market possibilities, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, he knows the price of everything, he can never get enough. And this is the atomic concept that profoundly individuates us in our own minds. I mean, the real danger of this concept is that the more students are taught about rational economic man, the more they actually mimic him, the more they value his traits of competition and self-interest over collaboration and altruism. So these models really profoundly make us. And it is this individuation that is so different to what you just described in ecology, which is all about the relations in between, and everything is defined by its relatedness to everything else. And we absolutely want to bring that back into the economics of Doughnut Economics through complexity, but also through recognizing the economy embedded in the living world.
So show us a picture of an economy living in a living world.
A picture of well, I could show you. I've got two of those. I could show you a donut, or I can. Well, no, all right. I'm going to go straight for that. The first diagram, instead of supply and demand, here's the first diagram I would show, and it's the biggest one. And we call it the embedded economy diagram. So it shows us that here's the market. That's supply and demand. Yes, but there's the economy embedded in society, embedded in the living world, and it's drawing in material and matter, putting out waste and pollution, bathed in a river of energy. So you've got thermodynamics on day one. And it just recognizes that the economy is a subsystem, which I think it's the 101 move of ecological economics, right? It's the critical move. It's a subsystem of society and of the living world. And therefore, its workings must be aligned with their health and well-being. It's not in service to maximizing itself. It's in service to a much greater whole and the health of that. And yes, there is the market. And actually, it's an incredibly powerful means of exchange and provisioning when used smartly. And there's the state. And the 20th century economics textbooks that I read just were a back and forth ideological boxing match between these two: laissez-faire capitalism, state-loving socialism. Which one are you for? Choose. And actually, that completely misses what runs here: the household of unpaid care and the commons of collaboration. These produce huge value, often with no money changing hands, often things that can't be bought and sold through the market or provided by the state. So we emphasize that we need all four of these forms of provisioning that need a massive rebalancing from where we are today, because we've inherited, many of us have grown up and born into Western economies where the market is the predominant institution, going back to what we were saying, not only crowding out space for the household, state, and the commons, but also crowding out social space, the work of Michael Sandel on what money can't buy, and the morals in the market. So we need to rebalance these. So for me, it's really important to start economic thinking, just seeing this whole from day one, and it politicizes economics from day one. We can ask about the power relationship between the market and the household, between the market and the state, between the market and the commons, the market and the living world. So we can have much richer conversations. But this is if this is a map of the terrain, we also need a compass of where we're trying to get to. And it's not, sorry?
No, you finish, sorry, go ahead.
So we need a compass of where we're trying to get to, and that maybe that's what you want me to show. I'm going to flip from the embedded economy to...
I don't want you to flip yet.
Don't flip yet.
You don't have to hold the thing up, but I want to
do.
talk a little more about household and commons, because people don't think enough about those.
Okay.
So household, care. In most indigenous cultures, people live in multi-generational households.
Mm-hmm.
Elders' wisdom is passed on, and elders are cared for. Children are educated, and children are cared for. And we have, by disaggregating our families, we have created a situation where now all of a sudden we have to pay for elder care and we have to pay for childcare. So we have actually your thing at 9 o'clock that says market is continually. We have social systems that are actually allowing it to expand into the domains where it may not be best suited.
Yes, and many countries, particularly in the global north, have a crisis of social care, which is the state provision of that elder care as well. So yes, the household, but also the commons, whether it's communal lands that are attended, communal gardens, festivals, culture, language, but also digital commons such as Creative Commons. I think there's a resurgence actually of the commons, because digital commons make it's almost so low transaction cost that people now experience the commons often first as a digital domain Creative Commons licensing. Wikipedia is probably one of the digital commons that everybody is familiar with. So these are phenomenal spaces of provisioning, and I don't think we can have well-being without their provisioning, and therefore they need to be recognized, they need to be named, and they need to be part of our economic construct of how do we make sure those spaces are protected. I mean, a simple example, if somebody takes leave from work to go on maternity leave or paternity leave, how much time do they get? Different countries and cultures legally give you, I don't know, in the US, is it what? I hear rumors it's something like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, that's off the scale insane. Whereas in some Nordic countries, it's a year if it's shared between the two parents. So there's different countries regulate this line between the market and the household and have huge impact on the ability of parents to care and provide care and critical early years developmental care in this protection from being forced back into your market relation with your use of time. And all of these lines are really actually regulated by the state, which has a double role of providing public goods itself, the classic ones, security, street lighting, but also the state regulates these spaces and protects the commons from encroachment by the market, patenting long-held traditional knowledge, for example, or squeezing households when they have a child. The state has a really important role to make sure that all of these forms of provisioning are given their due space, that they can work effectively together, that we can play our economic roles in all of these areas. So for me, yeah, we could talk for days around this. And I always come back to it because I think it holds a lot of the politics of relation that often get missed out in economics when it gets stripped of being a political economy conversation.
So I just want to remind us of one more commons, which is the climate.
Mm.
And I would
Yes.
that another one is actually the life force on Earth. The vibrancy of life itself is a commons that we all draw from. Okay.
Beautifully put. Yes.
So show us where we're going.
Okay, so if that's a map of the terrain, one way of drawing it, then the question is, where are we trying to get to, right? What's the goal? What's the intention here? And that's where this donut shaped concept comes in, which I can show you here. So it's a possible compass. It's only one of many possible compasses we could draw. It's not the way to see things. But if you imagine humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out for the center of this picture, then the hole in the middle is where people are left falling short on life's essentials, where people do not have the resources they need for health, education, housing, food, income. All of these are crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means all governments in the world have already recognized that everybody in the world has a right not to live in this hole. Get everybody over the social foundation with sufficient resources to live well. But there's another side to that. If as we all seek to meet our needs and then our oh so many wants, we risk not only getting into this green space of sufficiency, but going way beyond it and pushing on the ecological ceiling, starting to disrupt the life supporting systems of the planet. And out here are the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system scientists in 2009 as the critical life supporting systems that hold this planet in the stable balance, protecting the commons of conditions conducive to life. So the shape of progress here is not endless growth, it's balance. It's coming into balance where we meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And it's the kind of paradigm change that you realize you've hit when you see how people respond. When we change the goal, everything else that follows changes. When we change from pursuing endless growth measured in GDP or measured in corporate returns to actually pursuing balance measured in life's own metrics in human well-being and ecological integrity, it transforms what we think we're talking about when we're talking about economics, which at its Greek roots means the art of household management. So here's our planetary household. Let's learn about her. And how do we manage her in the interests of all her inhabitants, her human inhabitants and her non-human inhabitants? It's an utterly different task, and one that I think redefining economics that way is extremely fit for the 21st century. I mean, if I had been trained in economics as somebody who sought to steward the household in the interest of all of our inhabitants, I would actually be very proud to call myself an economist. I wouldn't even need to be a renegade. That would be my home turf. But we're having to reinvent it and reclaim the word because I think it's been profoundly financialized in the name of capital to maximize the accumulation of capital. So this is a reclaiming of the concept and redefining of its goal.
That's beautiful and essential. And there's an emerging field called ecological economics. Does that align with you?
Oh, absolutely. So when I set out to write Doughnut Economics, I started by reading all the economics I had never been taught. And right at the heart of that was ecological economics. I mean, the 101 move of ecological economics, as I said, is the economy is a subset of the living world. And when you recognize that, everything that follows changes. So that's at the core of that first diagram I showed, the embedded economy diagram. So ecological economics, I would say feminist economics, complexity economics, institutional economics. I read classic works in these and was so my brain was sort of flipping somersaults, and it kind of an massive excitement, but also a real anger at one level of why was I not taught this? Why was I never even told that these other schools of economic thought exist? I was just taught from books called economics, and they were never labeled, by the way, this is the mainstream neoclassical variety, or it's neoclassics versus Keynes. That's the breadth of the spectrum of debate we invite you to. So yes, ecological economics. And what happens when we don't just say there's ecological economics over there or feminist economics over there, complex economics out there, bring them together and try and make them dance on the same page. What is the interconnection between them? That's what I was trying to do with these 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist in Doughnut Economics.
So many other members of our audience are followers of Contemp Pathways and are continuously seeking to figure out how do they take their contemplative path and apply it in the real world. You last summer spent a week at Plum Village, and which is the home of Thich Nhat Hanh and his teachings. And is there some wisdom that came out from that you then see that integrates with Doughnut Economics?
It was a huge privilege to go there for a week last year. On a week organized by Christiana Figueres, taking around 100 people from within Europe. She was running regions around the world, and this was the European one. Thinkers, activists, working around climate and biodiversity issues. And 2 things for me stood out. One, I went into a very Zen space there. I wasn't trying to achieve anything. I was just going from hour to hour, and had this realization, looking at all the trees around us, that trees are deeply rooted into the earth. I mean, they're clearly part of the earth. They are part of nature because their roots literally connect them. And I think I was watching all the people walking around, and I think we humans can operate under a delusion, as if to say, like, look, Mom, no roots. I'm not rooted. I can jump up. I'm mobile. I must be therefore just me. Whereas these trees are rooted. I'm just me. And I suddenly had this vision of thinking, but actually what we've done is flip our roots inside. They're our lungs. If you think of all the little capillaries in our lungs, they are like roots branching out. And so we flip them inside and we're rooted to the air. And I suddenly was watching everybody walking around, breathing, and thinking we may not be rooted into the soil directly, we're rooted into the air. And we think we're separate, but you would find out pretty quick by doing this for more than 10 seconds that we really are not separate. I need a breath. So we discover that very quickly. One other thing I was really moved by, and very related to this about how we're rooted, is of course we eat. And Sister True Dedication in Plum Village took us through a beautiful a story of recognizing that every plate of food that you eat, she said, you need to see the world in your plate. And before you eat, sit and really contemplate, where did all this food come from? But what was it? What are the peas? The little green peas have grown out of soil made by worms and mycelium and water and sunshine. And so they're actually made of dust from a star coming it started, and I ended up drawing it up. It might be something that we share as a resource for schools at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. I'll share it here. Here we are. You can see it's my little drawing called "See the World in Your Plate," and an invitation to everybody to draw their plate of food and literally try and think of all the human and ecological care and generosity and miracle of life that's gone into bringing this food to our plate. And then when you eat, to realize this is the most intimate relationship we have with the earth, because this food that was earth and stardust literally becomes our bodies. So I found it a very beautiful experience of thinking about that interconnectedness and interrelatedness of things. And actually, I just want to say this past week, we had in Oxford a fantastic Hawaiian indigenous knowledge scholar and leader called Kamana Bima. And he taught me that in Hawaii, the word for land is aina. But actually, if you look at the roots of what that means, land literally means that which feeds. And I thought, how beautiful, because to me in English, the word land can sound a bit heavy and flat. It doesn't sound alive to me. It sounds like something somebody might plot on a piece. This land is ours. Whose land is that land? It could be brown field. It could be a forest. There's nothing clearly alive about it. But the word land in Hawaiian is that which feeds, which is just telling you every time you say the word that it's about that relatedness of living, and that we consume and are consumed, and we are part of cycles of life. So I thought it was just really profound. This little 4-letter word has inside it those conditions of life that you mentioned.
Willie, if you can find it, maybe if it's not easy, don't worry about it. But a video of Puna at the Garrison Institute talking about a Hawaiian wisdom holder. Willie, if you can find Puna talking about when she does a teaching on just a few words in language and what they mean, just like this. So what that also tells us is that along with economics, we have another ER, English language, which traps us in a hugely in a fixed world. In English, 70% of our words are nouns, and in indigenous languages, typically 15 or 10% are nouns, because they think of everything as much more alive than we do. And so going on retreats and developing a contemplative practice, there's an enormous free richness that is available to all of us in the beauty of nature and life processes that may be more enriching than IMAX theaters.
Yeah, and I just want to say that something that's the journey that I'm personally on with Doughnut Economics. It's it was originally a diagram of donut that I wrote as an Oxfam discussion paper in 2012, and I was blown away literally by the response of people saying, I've not seen a picture before. That's the way I've always thought about sustainability or well-being, but I've not seen the picture before, and the power of those pictures. And that led me to write Doughnut Economics and think about these 7 ways to think, again, drawing on, like I said, ecological and feminist and complexity, all these different kinds of economics, and always telling that story in pictures, because I had learned from the donut diagram, the power of pictures. And what happened when that book came out in 2017 that really astounded me and thrilled me was, I mean, some people said, this just makes sense. I love the ideas. But a lot of people said, I love the ideas and I want to do it, or I am doing it. I'm a teacher. I'm bringing this into my classroom. It's not on the curriculum, but this is what the students deserve to learn. I'm a town councillor or a mayor. Can we do this where we are? I'm setting up a business. I'm an entrepreneur setting up a really intentional social enterprise. This could be our logo. I'm a community organizer. We actually want to, people wanted to organize around it. And that's why we set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab, to help turn these ideas into actual practical practice that could begin now in an untransformed world. And so we're working across a spectrum of continuing to develop these ideas that I've just been expressing, what I've learned in Plum Village, and going deeper into indigenous thinking, and that's really drawing, teaching me to go beyond what my own mindset could see. And I'm really enjoying being drawn that direction, but also still keeping it very practically linked back to, okay, what could this town council do that they can take to all the councillors and to their community, that people will say, that makes sense to me where I am, and that this is feasible in the complexity of the country, the region, the world that we're in, because we can't transform everything. We can only start transforming the small part of the big system over which we have some design control. And that's really the work that Deal is doing. And it's a joy and it's a privilege to be able to keep moving the ideas, but keep them practical. So, and learning from practitioners. I'll say a last thing here, which is I really profoundly believe that 21st century economics is getting practiced first and will be theorized later as a result. And that's why we at Deal are hanging out with the practitioners and continually learning from them. How are you getting started? How is this working? What is feasible? So that we help put out those ripples of practice based on those who have already started to make it practical.
Fantastic. So we're going to move on to Leonora and Deal, but just one thing, you referred to these 7 new ways of thinking, and I just want to remind our viewers that those are they're explicated in 7 chapters in your book, and so we won't spend time going through those now, but just to know that they're there and they're very much okay.
Yeah, so, and just to say that the donut is the starting point. Okay, it's a new goal. Stop focusing on endless growth. Let's go for thriving in balance. And then these other ways do follow. We need to go from degenerative systems to regenerative ones, from divisive systems to distributive ones. We need to stop thinking in very mechanical terms as if we could ever control through policy. We can't. It's a complex system. Therefore, we can try to steward this system. So it's these kinds of ways of thinking. And I think one of the reasons why it's had traction internationally is because the book doesn't say, this is what to do. Here's the policy. Here's the answer. No, it's here's some ways of thinking. And now it's for you in your context, in your culture, in your community, in this crisis or in this opportunity to say, how would that way of thinking inform what we might do next? And so very different responses come in different parts of the world, perhaps from a shared way of thinking, but it shows up in very different kinds of policies because that makes sense to adapt to place.
So just because I want our audience to understand these 2 things. So just talk about divisive to distributive and degenerative to regenerative, because that's a very important framework for everything.
Okay. I'm going to have to do it with objects because that's just my way.
We really love it.
Okay. So we've inherited linear degenerative economies.
Yep.
The hose pipe of production. We stick things in the top. Energy, right? Fossil fuels, minerals, labor. We stick things in the pipe of production. We make it into stuff we want. We use it often only once, throwaway cup, and then let all the waste and pollution come out the bottom of that pipe, spew it out as pollution into the world. And this is what's running down the life support systems of the planet. It's pushing us over those planetary boundaries. It made billions of profit for major companies in the 20th century and bequeathed us all with depleted resources and deeply polluted global commons. So we need to turn a linear degenerative system into a circular, cyclical, regenerative one, regenerate and restore the quality of what's been depleted, but then create systems that can sustain themselves through regenerative design so that resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, collectively, creatively, and slowly. So that's the first shift from degenerative to regenerative. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that also we've inherited profoundly divisive economies that capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few. I think, the drawing capital into the hands of those who already have capital. And it creates a sort of the rise of the 1% that we've seen globally. We see it locally, and that's through privilege, through the coding of capital, as Katerina Pistor would put it, through design, through infrastructure. There's absolutely no way that 8 to 10 billion people can thrive within the means of the planet in such an extraordinarily divided world. The number of billionaires has doubled over the last decade, from 1,000 billionaires to now 2,000 billionaires. That's been supercharged by COVID. We have to turn this deeply divisive world into a distributive one. My favorite right? And we're back to relation now. We're back to the interconnectedness of everything. One that distributes value, that distributes opportunity to everyone who co-creates it. So thinking about who owns the enterprises. What if we have distributed small enterprises? Who owns the utilities? Who owns the land and the housing? How can it be designed in distributed ways so that the sources of wealth creation are owned in a far more distributive way? So we don't just continually create unequal societies and then try and make up for it through a bit of tax redistribution. You know, the vested interests are always going to stop that from happening. How can we create fundamentally more distributive sources of wealth creation in the first place? So those two dynamics for us are central, from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive. And again, what that looks like in different places and times and parts of the world in different moments is going to be different designs. There's no one way, but it's always that question: is this becoming regenerative of the living world? Is this becoming distributive of the value and opportunity that everyone is co-creating? We believe if it is, those dynamics are what will help us move into the donut from both sides at the same time.
Fantastic. I just want to give an example for the audience. So somebody calculated that, so when gasoline companies started putting lead in gasoline, they knew that lead was poisonous, and we knew, I mean, we've known for a century the negative effects of lead. Somebody calculated that in the United States alone, and lead has been used in gas all around the world, but that it cost Americans 824 million IQ points in terms of children being born with lower IQs, and that actually is significantly, in many ways, affecting. You could even say affecting the economy. The first thing people tend to say is, oh, and look at this impact on the economy. Well, actually, look on this impact on human quality of life and nature and ability to solve the complex issues before us. And so the current system does not have a feedback loop on degeneration. And part of the solution is that you know what ecological systems do is when something goes wrong, there's a really strong feedback system. So part of the way we move from regenerative to degenerative to regenerative, and selfish to distributive, is we actually need feedback systems that give you positive feedback and positive support for doing the right thing, and negative restriction for doing the wrong thing. You know, I was listening to a podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he said, in all the world's wisdom traditions, ultimately there were prescriptions of restraint. Whether you became a monk in any tradition, there was restraint. The moral codes were restraint. There was to do the right thing. There was also an understanding of what we should not be doing. And so our emerging moral economic system has to both have a view of what leads to flourishing, but also a deep understanding of how to prevent what doesn't.
And if I can just riff on that, when I first drew the donut, some colleagues in Oxfam, I'm gonna be honest, some American colleagues in Oxfam said, "Oh, we Americans, we don't like boundaries. Not sure we like this diagram. When this is stereotyping, right? But this is what somebody said to me. When we Americans see a boundary, we want to shoot right through it." And I said, "Really? So if you are holding a newborn baby and their temperature goes above 40 degrees, do you go, you go through that boundary, go on, you go?" No, you do not. You do everything you can to bring that child's temperature down. And it made me realize, actually, when we want to challenge ourselves about endless growth and busting through boundaries, just bring this conversation to your body, because our body, like the planetary body, is a delicately balanced, complex, adaptive system. And we already understand much of this in our body. Our body thrives by being in balance, enough and not too much. We do not want things endlessly to grow in our body. We call them cancer, and we move to take them out. We do not want to break boundaries of our body because we know that kills us. So actually, I often say, think of it this way: if boundaries make you feel bounded in, actually, and hey, we've got two architects here, Leonora and Jonathan, you're going to know this, right? Boundaries unleash our creativity. Give me some design parameters. Don't give me a blank page. Give me some design parameters, and that will make me design something I never had to do before. And I will come up with something more creative because I had to do it within boundaries. So I think this is a 21st century challenge. Come on, humanity. How are we going to meet the essential needs of all people within the means of the living planet? If I flip it a little bit flat, I think of it as a sort of a boundary space within which incredible creativity can arise. What are we going to dream up that allows us actually to thrive in this space? And that's, again, the work we do as Deal with the cities that show up, with the teachers who show up, the communities that show up, the businesses that show up. They're the ones we like, come on, let's learn together what you can design and what you can start to make possible within this ambition of living in this bounded space, because we know that boundary creates health, creates resilience, and unleashes our creativity.
So Lenore, let's talk about some examples. Tell us about Grenoble.
Just straight telling into about Grenoble. Well, Grenoble is one of the many cities that have kind of started experimenting with Doughnut Economics in various ways. And as Kate was basically just saying, it's a space in which these boundaries can unleash creativity. And we've been very open and flexible in inviting cities, inviting local governments to be creative, to be adaptive, to be responsive to their contextual needs, to pick up these ideas, the concepts from the book, and the many tools and resources we're creating at Deal, and to turn them into something that makes sense in their own space. So they've been even innovating. Different spaces have been innovating in various ways and using Doughnut Economics to respond to many problems that are kind of context specific, but often quite common between different places in the world. And so for Grenoble, they brought in the ideas of Doughnut Economics into their work as a way to underpin their new conversation and this political ambition and approach that's set called Grenoble 2040. And they chose Grenoble 2040 because they started this work in 2022, kind of guided by this question: when the children born today become adults, they turn 18 years old, what is the world that we are leaving them? What is the world that we created with them? And what is the world we want to imagine for them? We want to start reimagining for them. So they brought in Doughnut Economics as a way to really fuel this way of thinking about the future in a way that starts from recognizing where we are today. So they, like many other cities, have been working on developing what we call a city portrait. And that's really a variation of, you have the overshoot donut, Kate, there as a prop.
What I do.
Of course she does. That's a variation of that overshoot donut based on cities, on regions, of villages. So kind of asking this question of looking through all these themes in the social foundations, looking at the themes in the ecological ceiling, thinking about our local impact, but also about our global impact and global responsibilities. Where are we setting our targets? Where are we setting our ambitions as a place? And how can we do this by recognizing the limits of the living world, those planetary boundaries? And then how are we actually doing right now towards achieving those targets? How are we, how are we doing right now? And what are the best available indicators that we have to measure this? So the donut, Kate, it's okay, you don't need to hold it for a long time. Thank you.
I just want to emphasize that all those little red things were overshoots. That's all where you're exceeding planetary boundaries.
That's where you're exceeding the planetary boundaries on the outside, and on the inside, that's where people are falling short on their life's essentials. So when you turn this into an image of your place, it tells you we're using, we're producing too many greenhouse gases. We are having too strong of an impact on biodiversity. We are having actually negative impact on communities elsewhere to our unethical practices, procurement, lifestyles, impacts that are being exported and felt elsewhere. But also we are falling short on meeting the needs of our people here. People don't have enough access to affordable housing or to health services or to healthy food, et cetera, et cetera. So once it is a very simple way to start the conversation about where you are and when you want to go, but one that hasn't been very common in many places, in many local governments. We're lacking the tools, we're lacking the models, we're lacking these holistic frameworks that enabled us to see the big picture of where we are and then to start reimagining where we want to move forward. So to go back to Grenoble, they start from this idea of where are we doing, how are we currently doing now? They're building through internal learning in their administration and will be continued to kind of build through participatory practices, talking to residents, to many organizations, to academics, to the civil sector, to businesses in their territory, to co-create this image of Grenoble, their portrait, and then, like many other places, to start identifying, as they already have, where is action most needed, how, and what do they need to do to start turning that image around, to start removing those red wedges. So kind of having that image of a place allows you to start having a conversation across departments, across stakeholders about where are priorities, where are we doing really, really poorly, and where do we need to prioritize action, investment, cross-sectoral collaboration, partnership building in order to move this around, and where, and how do we take a different direction forward so that we don't continue in this direction. So that's, one big starting point and for Grenoble and for other places that then ends up translating and impacting a number of internal and external processes, including how we actually make decisions in local government. And that this is a big one, a big invisible factor that has impact on all of us living in places governed by public services. How are decisions actually made? Based on what? Guided by what? Guided by finance or guided by human and ecological well-being? And kind of bringing Doughnut Economics has, in Grenoble, started a process of making decisions in a different way, of actually judging them based on what is their ecological impact and human impact. And again, you would think that that's very simple and obvious, but in many, in common business as usual practices in the public sector, that's not how decisions end up being made.
So one of the things you told me was that one of the impacts is that city governments begin to see their silos and they begin to integrate more, just having them all share ideas, information, and practices and collaborate in itself can be transformational.
I do think that the biggest levers of transformation in local governments are hidden in those organizational structure and processes that are the backbone of how we actually work in local governments. And this is one of those problems that I said in the most wildly different contexts, from Mexico City to Thimphu, from Grenoble to Brussels. They all have this common thread of being designed in silos and in sectors. And all local governments, all people that I've been speaking to, whether it's technical staff or elected leaders, have highlighted and recognized this as a problem in the practices. So just the very possibility to kind of start breaking these silos using the concepts of Doughnut Economics, using these tools, has started moving the needle internally and externally from a lot of places. Have people from the health department started talking to people from the environment department they actually never met before. They were working on two strategies that could really benefit each other. A lot of co-benefits could have been built instead of working in this siloed space in which we've been used to thinking about trade-offs rather than co-benefits. It's this rather than, it's helping people rather than the environment, and not working towards both of them jointly. So I think it's one of the most powerful uses of Doughnut Economics in local governments has been starting to break these silos, and then this kind of ball starts rolling. A lot of things start happening in the background, a lot of new ideas and new possibilities once you've turned around the system in which people were really a bit locked and blocked.
So any examples, on the ground examples of something that post-deal is different than pre-deal?
Well, I mean, first, I gotta say, I think one of the problems and challenges of today is that we really want to see very tangible, quick, and easy examples and solutions on the ground, and those tend to exist on the on the surface. And it's a lot like interesting. It's a lot like sexy to be talking about the slow but big shifts that happen that then enable kind of a big rise in a lot of changes. But I can also I can speak through some examples of from places that have been working for a while, and this impact start being visible and kind of tangible. Let's say we can start with the first city that worked with Doughnut Economics, Amsterdam. They use the concepts to design and plan their circular economy strategies, setting really high ambitions or circularity, but also taking a new approach and a new way of thinking about circular economy, in which they brought in a very strong understanding of the planetary boundaries, and the need to recognize their impact elsewhere, that they export elsewhere, and that isn't just localized. And two is they really brought strongly the conversation about always thinking about a social foundation. So in circular economy strategies and approaches, they can often end up in this narrow tunnel of only focusing on the environmental impact, whereas they've really been thinking about a social foundation and planetary ceiling. And so they did a kind of a big strategy, starting to measuring their material flows, and now they've rolled out a lot of different small actions and projects, really inviting and kind of opening this floor of working together with all Amsterdams, all types of organization, because it's necessary to work with anything. So anything from, the city implemented a kind of a city pass for low-income households that gives them a pass for clothing repairs, giving them discounts. So both supporting those on low incomes to access basic needs, but also kind of encouraging the growth of the sharing and the repair culture and economy. They've started, they created these denim deals, they were called, they had a lot of clothing and textile manufacturers and companies in the area. So they started working, they kind of made a big deal with a lot of these big producers, asking them to use a certain percentage of recycled textiles as part of every product that comes out. They started finding ways to encourage and started experimenting in specific places on developing community land trusts. So a new type of housing model that wasn't as common, and that the regulations and policy wasn't really welcoming in Amsterdam. That's really when local people own and manage and develop housing that becomes permanently affordable for locals. And at the same time, bringing in the circular economy principles into these new types of development. So really thinking in various ways of balancing the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And maybe another, sorry.
Okay. No, I was going to ask about the Real Price Initiative.
The Real Price initiative, which I have to admit, I'm not sure how it's rolled out in practice, but the idea behind it is to start understanding and kind of measuring and transparently sharing the true cost of products. That's not just the ecological cost, the social cost, and not just the price tag on it, so that consumers as well as resellers and producers can really have the awareness of what is actually the cost of this cup, and where was it produced, and where were the materials extracted, and what did it cost the local communities, and not just the 2 pounds that I will pay in my shop. So that's, I think, one of the many creative ideas that has come from what is now a long process of kind of circularity based on Doughnut Economics in Amsterdam.
So that goes back to Kate's see what's on your plate and tries to make the relationality of it, the human and natural relations of that, more visible. So Erinch, let's talk about the deep design of business, because business has grown enormously under this idea that it has no constraints, or that it resists them as much as possible. Certainly in the United States, the big business is always lobbying to remove regulations, allow for their endless growth. So how do you deeply design business, and how does business thrive within constraints?
I mean, it's the $1 million question, Jonathan. Essentially, we need companies to pursue the sort of dynamics Kate expressed, to be regenerative and to be socially distributive. And sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they can because it also meets the requirements to be in service to finance, to deliver maximum returns, maximum margins, increase the share price, increase sales volumes and margins overall. And sometimes it doesn't. And what we're finding in our work with companies, and we've now done workshops with over 700 business leaders from across different sectors, different size of businesses, different geographies, is that in their heart of hearts, business leaders know what needs to be done. If you ask somebody in the fashion industry that has the wherewithal to turn up to anything focused on sustainability, they know that fast fashion needs to go. And we need a very different formulation of that industry. If you speak to someone in agriculture, we know that high input, intensive monocrop agriculture is destroying the soil, is ripping apart agricultural communities and having huge human rights impacts on many people as well. That needs to be transformed. We need to move away from it. We know in energy, we need to move away. So all of these sectors, there's a transformation that needs to happen. But to focus on growth and to focus on being in service to finance is holding back that transformation that is A, inevitable, and B, urgent. We need to do it. We need to do it now. And it's being held back by the way we've designed companies to be in service of finance and to grow.
So, Kate, do you have a guide for us on how businesses should think? And then Erinch, take us through them?
You want my cardboard cutout? I'm addicted to cardboard. Cardboard's handy. This is for Erinch to talk to.
So the way we work through this, and I believe in the chat we've just shared a link to an article that myself, Kate, and the wonderful and amazing Marjorie Kelly have written, an article based on this very framework, on the purpose of a business, the networks of relationships it has, the governance model and the way power and decision making is structured, the ownership model and what that enables and holds back, and its relationship with finance in terms of what finance demands of the business. And these 5 layers of design together help us understand the deep design of business, help us get to what is at the heart of business, what is truly driving it, and how is it able to take the decisions that shift its strategy, that transform its business model, that invest into the kind of activities and transitions that it needs to drive forward. So across those 5, we see a whole bunch of interesting innovations. So if we look at purpose, for instance, at the top of the signboard that Kate is holding up, purpose is really about, why does the business exist? Does it need to exist in its current iteration? What are the products or services that it's providing into the world? And essentially, what is this raison d'etre, right? So we can ask that of any company. If you look in the chocolate industry, for instance, there's a really interesting company called Tony's Chocolonely that began in the Netherlands as a campaign by really a journalist who wanted to do away with slave labor in the cocoa industry, and embedded this idea that we can have a slave-free cocoa chocolate industry at the heart of a business, and everything it does is structured around that. We look at networks, it's about the relationship. So you can bring in, for instance, the supply chain into the design of a company. Say that, look, we want long-term commitments to the suppliers. And if you're in consumer products, that's where 70%, over 70% of your impacts are. Don't tell me about what's happening in your head office, where maybe you're employing like 14 or 18, professionals, the actions in your supply chain. So how are you bringing that into the design of the company? Examples like El Puente in Germany are saying, hey, look, the supply chain can be represented in the ownership model and in the governance. We can have somebody on the board that is answerable to our long-term suppliers in the supply chain. Governance, all about decision-making, power, and essentially what gets prioritized in the business. And one of the companies we've engaged with, Faith in Nature, have decided to put nature on their board of directors. So one of their 11 board of directors is represented by the organization Lawyers for Nature. And they're an independent voice that's challenging decision-making, privy to all the internal documents, and becomes a focal point for people in that business to drive more ambitious ideas, more challenging ideas, and come up with new directions for the company. Ownership, that's all about the way what the rights of owners are, what they expect of the business, and how they're able to drive it. Everyone's heard of Patagonia, which went to a new ownership model that said that, hey, Earth is now our only shareholder. But that actually builds on a tradition of steward ownership that has been brewing for decades and decades across Europe, where you're deliberately structuring share classes to separate money and power in the ownership model of the business. And lastly, finance. So this is where the rubber really hits the road. What are the expectations on margins? If you're an early stage business and you're getting early stage equity investment, what are the expectations of venture capital? What's in the term sheet? Let's open that up. What kind of power and priority is finance demanding in order to push particular financial metrics onto the business? And how are we allowing people to pursue ambitious ideas that are regenerative and distributive that may push up against the demands of finance? And again, here it's important to note that you can have commercially viable ideas that are held back by business and by finance because they're not quite hitting the right return requirements. You want even more, you want higher, you want greater growth, you don't want to leave anything on the table. And all of these are the deep design features, layers of business that determine what a business can do and what a business can be in this world. And that's what we're trying to challenge. That's what we're trying to open up. Thank you, Kate. You can put that down.
Any examples?
I mean, loads. So, for instance, at the moment, actually, we're in the midst of pulling together a set of case studies from around the world. I'm really excited about this. I'm reviewing a bunch of really interesting models, including at the heart of some very large companies. Like there's one of the world's biggest brewer, AB InBev, has got a subsidiary in Brazil that is 100% profit reinvesting model. It's called AMA. And what they do essentially is that they sell bottled water into areas that need fresh, clean water, and they reinvest all the profits, and that enables them to pursue new strategies in new parts of the world. In India, there's a multi-$100 million business called Amul that is co-owned by the smallholder dairy farmers. Across the world, we're seeing models where the farmers co-own the business, artisans co-own the business. We're seeing interesting hybrids like Lush, which is a company based in the UK but operates globally, that has said, hey, we're going to have a hybrid model where the family owns about half the shares and the employees own the other half. And this is going to allow us to have a more balanced approach to our core decision making. So we're seeing actually a bit of a renaissance here of alternative models that are building on the shoulders of some of the giants of this sector, including the cooperative movement, the social enterprise movement, and others that have really pioneered community ownership, that have pioneered alternative ways of designing companies. And now we're seeing a real explosion of alternatives that are emerging around the world as people are seeking structures and designs that are better suited for today's challenges.
Yes. So in fact, before the Europeanization of the world, the previous indigenous world had many different systems of ownership or non-ownership, and very often people had rights of use, but but there wasn't specific title in either land or many other resources. They had many different ways of allocating to achieve greater fairness and a, a better level of distribution and regeneration. And so the idea that we're dissolving or beginning to dissolve this monoculture of one way of owning and finding that there are these multiple ways of owning. I actually even think we knew a new word, because owning to me in its very self has this sense of like, I own this, versus we collectively are responsible for, benefit from, but also co-nurture that.
Can I jump in on this point, because it's so attuned? So I mentioned Kamana Bima, Hawaiian indigenous scholar, who was here in Oxford recently, and we were in a conversation in a conference, and so I was preparing for the conference, and I said I really want to talk with Kamana about the Hawaiian, that he's got a fantastic concept of the ancestral circular economy. It's not a new thing; it's an old thing. It's being brought back, and they are seeking to create new economic futures in Hawaii. So I said, I really want to talk with Kamana about this. But of course, as I sat there thinking, yeah, we're going to talk about purpose and networks and governance and ownership. And I had that exactly as you just said, John, this doesn't really feel quite right. So actually, when Kamana came over for supper at my house beforehand, we, as many good ideas emerge, it kind of on the inside of a chocolate packet. We started sketching on the back of an envelope stuff. And we came up with a new version of this. And I want to show you, because we came up with a new word to replace ownership. I think you just said non-ownership, and in particular when it comes to land. So let me hold up the new one. I feel like doing a gradual reveal here, but I don't think I can. So instead of purpose,
wait, just I have a question.
Yeah, go on.
How new is that sign?
It's 2 days old.
All right. So we might be one of the first groups to ever see it.
Well, it has been in a conference in Oxford where I sat and held this one, and Kamana sat and held this one on the stage, and we compared them side by side. But I don't think I can do this on a Zoom screen, so I'm going to show you.
We can do it, but don't worry. I just want to see where we're going. I don't know.
Okay, so instead of purpose, we've got responsibility. Kamana said, I can say, what's my purpose? I've got this purpose, but actually given to us by our elders, by our position in the world, by our relation to the rest of the living beings, we have a responsibility. What is our responsibility to life? I thought that was a beautiful reframing. It's much, purpose is quite me. I have this purpose, but the kind of the we, it's, this responsibility is with you. Instead of networks, we renamed it as relations. I think network, we intend a very similar meaning there. You're in relation with all living beings, with your suppliers, your customers, your employees, and all living beings. And how do you hold yourself in these relations? We changed governance to agreements. What are the agreements, formal or informal, we find ourselves in? And then this is the one where we had a lot of fun, where somebody says, I own this land. We were saying, the land must be laughing, saying, mate, I've been here for 3.8 billion years. You're kind of come and gone in 100 years. You think you own me? So we flipped it to knownership. So not do you own the land, but are you known to this land? And do you know this land? Do you have an intimate knowledge of this land? And are you recognized by it? And of course, this is one of the hallmarks of indigeneity, is like a deep, long woven relationship with that land. So knownership, you saw it here first. And flows, finance, right? Finance, again, I started this whole conversation with the accumulative exponential curve of finance. Why should finance be designed to accumulate? Surely it should flow and not always expect that it's going to get bigger by 15% every year. So flows, and I'm just going to invoke Janine Benyus here, who once said to me, a tree only grows to the point that it can no longer distribute nutrients beyond the tips of its outermost leaves, and then it will stop growing. So for the tree, its growth is defined by its ability to generate flow, because it knows that is the health of the whole body depends upon flow. So what if you take that metaphorically from a tree to community, what would it mean? Or for a company within, right? I mean, this is just a whole other conversation to dive into, and I can't wait to have this conversation with Erinch and many, many others. Let's take Kamana's signpost, and then, which business founders, leaders, thinkers would we want to really say, what happens when we shift this language? Because we know that language shifts thought, and it shifts how we conceive of things, and could we come up with new and different possibilities for what we call a business or enterprise by thinking it through these frames.
And I think what's maybe in common throughout those is it's challenging the dominance of finance. Like the way businesses are currently designed across purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance, and the five that Kate's holding up. Finance demands something, and you can do other things when you're in service to finance, and we celebrate all that. And there might be people on this call that work a lot on this area of sustainability and the business case for sustainability and finding ways to achieve maximum returns while solving social and ecological crises. That's great. But my warning and my request, I guess, to everyone is let's hold off a bit on over celebrating those, because that's making the case for preventing change. That's saying everything can work while we remain in service to finance. Let's find the things that aren't allowed to happen. Let's redefine our relationship to finance in the ways that we're talking about, and in many other ways that are going to unlock and enable the kind of actions that we know that aren't happening. We know we're going backwards on material use, for instance. The last 5 years alone, we've had about the same amount of material use as the entire 20th century. The percentage of the economy that we can describe as circular is on the decline, according to the Circular Economy Foundation, who does the Circular Gap report every year. We know that on climate, on renewables, on everything that is meaningful, we're not progressing, we're not transforming. And the things that we're celebrating are actually holding back the more honest, difficult conversation we need to have about let's redesign and redefine what the relationship with finance deliberately, at least in the short term, as a way to unlock the very transitions that we all know that we must pursue.
So, Kate, hold up the sign again.
The new one. Yeah. And before you dive in, can I just say also, I should have said this when I held up. So ownership works particularly if we're thinking about our relation to land. And I said to Kaman, okay, but what if you're thinking about the design of a company? And he said he also might have said kinship before we came up with this word, but also this could, of course, be stewardship, right? How is this enterprise stewarded? And I think it connects really well to what Erinch was just saying, is what is the relation of finance to the stewarding of the agreements, of the relations, of our responsibility? So are we all in service to finance, or actually is it flowing in service to these? Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
So if you construct a business based on these, it feels to me like the business would be much more stable and sustainable. When I read these, when I read the previous ones, they feel within them an ambition in a competitive world that forces you to continue to have to outcompete. In this one, they feel like you have a place in a world that sustains you and nurtures you. I'm going to give an example, which is actually much more sustainable and strategic. There is a movement that came out of Europe called the Stewardship Ownership Movement, or creating purpose trusts. And one of the first companies to do that is a publishing company called Barrett Kohner in the United States. And they publish business books, and they tend to publish how to make the world a better place business books. They became a purpose trust. And in part of the ownership, they have the printer who makes their books. They have their best-selling authors who really are the big income drivers. They offered ownership to their customers. So they have built this whole, and obviously they have key employees, et cetera. So now all of a sudden, the whole ecosystem of the company, or a much larger ecosystem, I think the distributor is also in the ownership. So the ecosystem of the company is all of a sudden reflected in its ownership, and it's to everybody's benefit that it thrive. And so if you think about that, and if there's a paper shortage, you're the guys, your company's more likely to get its books published, or you're more likely to have your best-selling authors not picked off by another company or whatever. So actually, when you think about deeply immersing yourself in those ideas, it feels to me like that our current structure causes an enormous amount of competitive tension that melt away with that.
That's absolutely correct. And there is actually a lot of data to show that companies that do embody the kind of designs we're mentioning are more resilient. They do stand the test of time. In my previous role, when I was leading the World Fair Trade Organization, we did some research on this because all of our members, the 400 plus social enterprises that were fully practicing fair trade, they were all reinvesting at least half of their profits back into their social mission. That had long-term relationships with people, that had ownership and governance that locked in purpose. But what was interesting is that they were 4 times more resilient than mainstream SMEs. And the reason that is not because they made 4 times more money. It's because they had long-term resilient relationships with each other. They had situations of trust and solidarity. When COVID-19 hit, a group of 20 of them came together in Asia, for instance, to have a joint catalog, to have joint product development, to create new products for the reality of COVID. They were able to support each other and pay up front or withhold payments, knowing that there was a long-term relationship, so they could absorb shocks with each other, located in different parts of the world through their trading relationships. And as a result, they're 4 times more resilient than mainstream SMEs. The problem that I come across and the challenge I get in this work is, what if I need a lot of capital now to make this business a success? I need 500 million, and this isn't going to be a commercially viable business unless I can get to a certain scale. And the only thing available to me is venture capital, and they're not going to play ball. They're not going to enable any other kind of model to work. And once I'm on that bandwagon, it's hard to get off. There's a big exit on its way and a potential long-term IPO on the way. And the ship has sailed. You've lost control over the mission and the purpose that this company was started off with. I meet dozens of people who've been in this situation, and I have met even more over my course of 15 years of my career doing this kind of work. So a part of it is also, the shaping the journey of the startup so they don't become stuck. But those steward-owned companies and other kinds of employee-owned models, other kinds of social enterprise models, typically, when they get to a particular maturity, they don't need a huge injection of capital, and maybe a bit of debt might be sufficient to get them through their short-term or medium-term capital needs. It's a perfectly viable structure, even in this model. So, and then imagine if we were to redesign the market, redesign regulation, redesign the economy to be in service of these sorts of businesses. Imagine how amazingly thriving that these enterprises would be. So they're able to be more resilient, even in this cutthroat sort of marketplace. But yeah, we do have this issue of access to finance being a problem for some entrepreneurs who feel it's not available to them to do this kind of enterprise design.
So I want to talk about an example of an alternative enterprise design. The most successful football team in the United States, in the entire history of the United States football, is a team called the Green Bay Packers. They have won more titles than anybody else. They are community owned, whereas all the other football teams are owned by billionaires who buy them and sell them to zillionaires. And the Green Bay Packers long ago were sold to the community, and individually the community has ownership. It means they will never leave that community, and they don't have the enormous money behind them, but they have the greatest success.
And can I just jump in and say these design principles, which we really learned and slightly adapted from the wonderful work of Marjorie Kelly, it applies not just to the world of business. We think it applies to every organization, right? We can apply it to a university, to an NGO, to a foundation. It applies to cities. And in fact, Leonora has been developing this with city councils, that if you really, really want to get serious about whether or not we can bring about transformation, and we need to look at stuff that's usually off the table. I remember when we first did this in the very first workshops with Amsterdam actually called us back in 2019. They said, but if we want to get into the donut, we need to transform our own organization. Can you run a workshop with us? And we brought these 5 design traits. And I remember colleagues there saying, you mean we're actually going to talk about this? Like, this is normally the design of the organization that you work in is normally off the table or under the table. And like, no, this is exactly what we're going to talk about. And city councils have been using it. I don't know if Leonora wants to jump in, but city councils are using this to really reflect on what's deeply stopping them or enabling them to bring about change in their own organizational design.
Lenora?
Should I judge? Well, it is, as Kate said, indeed, it's often these things where the biggest potential to actually make, really unleash social and ecological impact, really do big change, are in these kind of deep layers of design that never enter the agenda of conversation as separate. They're just, these institutions have been designed, these processes have been designed, the assets are owned as they're owned, the land, the housing, the utilities. A lot of these things end up not being questioned for decades. So it has been useful for many places to start bringing these conversations to the fore and really being able to see those kind of systemic enablers. And when it comes to cities, particularly looking at it, there are of course a lot more complex and bigger ecosystems than most businesses, but a lot of inequality lies within the patterns of ownership, of land, of data, of utilities, of housing, and what does the land ownership, housing that is owned by the council or by someone else, what does it lead to when it comes to the quality of life of people on the ground? What does it enable, or what does it prevent from happening? And the same in very different patterns when we're looking at the finance of cities, how they raise their revenues, what are they dependent on, what kind of developments, investments that have horrible ecological impacts are they in a way forced to do because the finance demands it of them in order to be provide services. What are the taxing powers that they have or they not have in order to raise money differently and redistribute them differently. So a lot of different but very similar conversations can and are being held in cities in this invisible world of deep layers of design.
I want to go back to design intent. So one of the things is things do not have to maximize profitability. So for example, in the United States, the great home ownership boom of the 1950s and 60s and 70s was funded by local savings banks that were owned mutually, which means they were actually owned by the depositors. And they did a really good job of serving their communities and also investing in local businesses. Starting in the 80s and then 90s, there was a vast movement for the big banks to take them over, to buy them out, to demutualize and make those relationships more profitable. But what was lost entirely in the urge to become more profitable was that entire system of deep mutuality. Kate, what was the in-between relationship and knowership? What was the missing? There was one word.
Which one do you want?
I can't remember. Governance. No. Agreements. Okay.
Agreements.
Okay. Now we have a question from Chris Brown, who's a colleague of yours, and he asks about Colin Meyer's idea of the economics of mutuality, and asks, so how does this idea of the economics of mutuality fit in?
Say more about what you're bringing here on the economics of mutuality. I mean, are we talking about companies or as abstract concepts?
Well, let's take it about companies. And are you familiar with the idea?
No, I'm not specifically. Erinch may be more than me, but
go for it,
so that everybody on the call is familiar with what we're invoking here. Go for it, Erinch.
Sure. I mean, I am familiar with it. I've engaged with the team that has been working on this over the years in various iterations, actually, and huge admirer of the work of Colin, but also the broader economics of mutuality world. I think the difference that I've noticed is that Doughnut Economics, and I've typed this briefly into the chat as well, but Doughnut Economics, I think, in our work is a bit more explicit about the need to design out some of the power and priority that finance has in the business. And to be a bit more explicit about this, because this is uncomfortable, right? To talk about power, to talk about priority. Where does the money go? Who has power over decision makers? Who's a co-owner? Who's not? Who's got representation on the board? Who's not? So I think we go a bit more explicitly at that. And secondly, there's a real focus for us on doing this not for normative reasons, not for ideological reasons, but as a practical way to unlock the very strategies, the actions, the investments, the business models that we need to pursue. Because there's a whole bunch of things that aren't happening. So let's redesign to allow them to happen. And asking business leaders to put those ideas on the table that they're often scared to, because you sound naive by putting them on the table, to talk about the really difficult things, like everything from tax behavior to supply chains to product design to marketing to the entire kit caboodle of the business itself. Put the biggest, most difficult ideas on the table that may not be commercially viable, and then ask yourself, how do I redesign to allow these things to happen? So I think that's a core difference. I think the economics of mutuality recognizes the fact that for a business to thrive, all its stakeholders need to thrive. This is my own summary of that field of work, and I think Colin May has really pushed these ideas of the purpose of the corporation beyond what was previously, I think, discussed and debated. But I think if we want to change anything, and the current dominant model is to be in service to finance, then we can't dodge the fact that we have to design down some of the power and priority finance has if other things are going to have power and priority for that business.
I want to give one example, and then we're going to close. I have a friends from Trinidad, and in Trinidad, they're one of the places around the world that grows chocolate. And the global commodities market is very happy to buy it from them in its raw form. But they decided to start creating a co-op to process it and sell it at higher value. And the global commodity market said, we won't buy it from you. If you take out our slice of the processing value, then we're not going to buy anything from you. And so ultimately, there is an invisible world of this global financial system and its motivations that has to change if we're really going to liberate the transformation at the more micro level, which is what is needed. If you just to go back to that analogy of the earth that we began with, there's a phrase that I love, which is everything is mutually evolved. The earth is 13.8 billion years. I'm sorry, life on it. Well, the earth is 13.8 billion years old, and the universe is. And whether you're a microbacteria in your stomach or a lichen on a tree or a human being, you all are 13.8 billion years old in your lineage. And we all have an equal role in that coevolution. And so we have to dissolve the idea that some of us are going to thwart the evolution of others. And Doughnut Economics is a beautiful way to think about a pathway for moving forward. So Kate, Leonora, and Erinch, thank you so much for joining us today and for such a fantastic conversation. And audience, we thank all of you for joining us and sticking with us in this wonderful conversation. I want to remind you, look in the chat. We are holding an amazing course, the Garrison Institute, on inner transformation for social impact. It has extraordinary speakers who will guide you processes to think about how you can transform your inner realm to make you a higher social impact leader. There's information in the chat. This talk will soon be up on the Garrison Institute website, and we encourage you to share it. And also, we encourage you to click the donate button and make a donation or become a sponsor. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much for your really deep and thoughtful and wonderful comments. You have elucidated today for us a pathway to planetary health.
Thanks for hosting us today, Jonathan. Real pleasure to be in the conversation.
Bye.